Hello, everyone. We're all very excited to have you here. It's a Friday, so we're very happy you're all here. Welcome to the event Reimagining the Economy is co-hosting with the Central Bank of Mexico and ITAM University on new developments in the labor markets of Mexico and the US. So who we're going to have with us today? So first, we're going to have Lorenzo Aldeco. He's a PhD in economics from Brown University. He works in the Central Bank of Mexico doing research in economics. And he researched several aspects of the Mexican labor markets with spatial perspective, in particular work on internal migration and homicides in Mexico, published in the GDE. We also have with us Daniel Chiquiar. Daniel Chiquiar is a current professor of economics in the Department of ITAM. He holds a BA of ITAM, and he's a PhD economist from UCSD, specialized in international trade and trade macroeconomics. He's former Banxico from the central bank, so he has been a main element to make all of this happen. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Lorenzo. And we have Professor Gordon Hanson, faculty lead of Reimagining the Economy, and no need for introduction for Gordon. So Gordon, I will give the word to you now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the fall semester. We're delighted to have you here. I want to open with just some brief remarks about where the idea for this event came from and what we're hoping to accomplish. So about 4 years ago, Danny Roderick and I launched the Reimagining the Economy initiative, whose objective is to think about how we create more good jobs in struggling economies, challenge that the United States faces, challenge that many higher income countries face, and challenges that have parallels in many middle income countries. The loss of industrial jobs, the rise of joblessness in the United States, persistent informality in Mexico are two sides of the same coin. As part of this effort, need a slide. We will get there. As part of this effort, what we've done is to try and build the data infrastructure that's needed to undertake this work. So when we think about among the persistent social challenges that we faced in the United States that are behind political polarization, that are behind rising income inequality, it's the disappearance of good jobs, high-paying jobs, particularly in manufacturing and other industrial sectors, and the difficulty that regions have had in replacing those good jobs with new lines of economic activity. In order to study this work, we need data. What economists have developed over the last couple of decades is a methodology that analyzes changes in the economy through the lens of local labor markets. So what is a local labor market? It's a region within which people live and work. Sometimes local labor markets follow the outlines of a city. Sometimes they're conglomerations of a city. So you think about what's the local labor market that in which Boston sits. It would include Cambridge, would include the North Shore, it would include South Boston, it would stretch west to Concord and Lexington. So within those regions is where, as economic activity changes, wages change, people move between jobs. Sometimes economic policy is set in those units, and sometimes it is not. What this map shows you is the change in joblessness, the fraction of individuals without a job between 2000 and 2022 for commuting zones, collections of counties in which people live and work, our definition of local labor markets in the United States. And we're focusing on prime age workers, 25 to 54, who historically have had very high employment rates, and those without a college degree. What we have seen in the US is the emergence of very high and persistence rates of joblessness as manufacturing has disappeared in these places. And our challenge then is to figure out why did this happen? What have we been doing about it in terms of government policy, and how might we do things better? So in the Reimagining the Economy project, and this is our data visualization platform called The Economy in Place, a beta version of which is now live and to which we can give you access. And this is a project that's been led by Rohan Sandhu, who helped us develop the Reimagining the Economy project. We have data on local labor markets going back several decades, employment, earnings, composition, and then we have data on the government programs. What are the resource flows that have gone? And now we're developing additional modules, one on the energy transition, how is energy created, what are jobs in energy-intensive sectors, and then the fourth module we'll be creating is on the local institutions that are there to engineer local economic development, specialized financial institutions, worker training programs, the public sector, nonprofit sector, and sometimes private sector entities that are responsible for this. So what we're going to hear today is parallel efforts that have been happening in Mexico, led by Daniel Chiquiar during his time at the Banco de México, and now in his work at ITAM, about constructing data on local labor markets in Mexico, thinking about the nature of those challenges, understanding what economic drivers have been responsible for those changing conditions. And then what we're going to do as a team after our presentations, first by Lorenzo, which will present their data tool, talk about some of the research they've done, and then Danielle will talk more about it, is that we're going to meet as a group to talk about joint work we can do in understanding parallels in the co-evolution of local labor markets and policy solutions to those challenges in the two countries. So with that, Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I have to turn this on, right? Okay, I think this is on. Is that all right? Yes. All right. So thank you for the introduction, and thanks also for the Malcolm Wiener Center for having us, for Reimagining the Economy for setting this up, and especially to Professor Hanson and Chiquiar, and who started out this project some years ago. The project has now been developed by staff at Banco de México, us research staff, and also the data team at the Microeconomics Lab, which we will also mention briefly about. So jumping in and picking up on the highlight, picking up on the insight that Professor Hanson pointed out. In labor economics, we think that because of transport costs and migration costs, wages and employment are determined at a local level, where local means a geographical space that shares workers and jobs. However, that's not the unit at which data is necessarily available. In Mexico, local data is published at the level of municipalities, which are analogous to US counties. And so what we claim is that by grouping together municipalities that share jobs and workers, we can create statistical units of analysis that better reflect the scale at which economic interactions are happening. And so that's what we do in this presentation, in this project, where we present a definition of Mexican local labor markets constructed using commuting flow data and the database that we have already published for the study of these local labor markets, where the final aim is to deepen the study of labor markets in Mexico. In this presentation, I'll do 4 things, each very quickly. First, I'll just present the concept of what a local labor market is, based on what commuting flows tell us about what municipalities are integrated. Then I'll show you how we construct local labor markets based on this insight. I'll then describe the databases that we have built, which are at the individual housing unit and local labor market levels. And then I'll show you 2 applications of this data that we have already kind of finished. So what is a local labor market given our data? Essentially boils down to asking which municipalities should be linked together or grouped together into the same commuting zone. or local labor market. And essentially, what the answer to that question is it depends on the commuting flows. So take an example of municipality A. In this diagram in the right that I'm showing you, illustrated by this little circle, this little blue circle, that is a suburb where people live mostly and not a lot of people work. And imagine that most people, most workers that live in A commute to a central business district B to work. Then if that is the case, these two places tend to be linked economically. If you have shocks, say to labor demand in firms B in B, making firms be more willing to pay for labor, that will translate to increased incomes for people in the suburb in municipality A, and also maybe increase prices, housing prices, consumption patterns, etc. So these two places are a shock to one place will translate to economic consequences in the other. And the same in the other direction, right? To the extent that the labor supply coming from A matters for B, productivity changes, say, related to illnesses, education, etc., that matter for A will translate to the productivity of firms in B. So A and B should be in the same local labor market. Now, it's not that every single set of municipalities that share commuters should be linked together. You might think that, say, if there's a third city, C, that sends a few commuters to B, and that commuting flow is small relative to the size of these two municipalities, and by size I mean the number of workers that live there. If that commuting flow is small, then we wouldn't necessarily want to link these two municipalities together. So just to give you another last example, commuting flows might help us link together municipalities that don't necessarily even share commuting flows between them. So for example, if there's a single suburb that supplies workers to two locations that are workplaces, say imagine a municipality Y where there is an airport and a municipality Z where there is a business district, even if nobody lives where the airport is and nobody lives where the business district is, so that nobody commutes between these two, to the extent that there's a labor demand shock, say by the airport hiring more people, that's going to increase the labor cost. That might increase the wages in the suburb and therefore increase the labor cost for firms in the business district as well. So we really need to take kind of like a nuanced approach to grouping these municipalities together when we have commuting flow data. And so the way we do that is by leveraging the methodology used by the Economic Research Service here in the US to construct US commuting zones. This method delivers groupings of municipalities that have a few desirable characteristics. First, they approximate the scale at which wages and employment levels are determined, following this intuition that I just described. Second, they cover all of the country's territory, which is important if you want to make sure that the analysis you're doing is representative of the whole country. And by grouping together places that share shocks or between which shocks are propagated, it creates units that tend to be more statistically independent from each other, which is important to make correct inferences when you run regressions. So I don't want to kind of go too much into the details of how this exactly works, but just to give you a sense of what this algorithm that we apply is doing, we just give a name to the commuting flow between a municipality I and a municipality J, and that's Fij. And what we do is first take all pairs of municipalities of origins and destinations, and they calculate a dissimilarity index between them, where the dissimilarity is essentially saying how unlinked two municipalities are to each other based on commuting flows. And this dissimilarity index is constructed in this formula that I have here in the slide, where if I can draw your attention to the right hand side of it to the second term, that essentially is just adding up the commuting flows in the numerator between these two places, and in the denominator, having the minimum size between these two places that we are studying. So essentially what this is saying is the second term is going to be larger when commuting flows between two places are large relative to the size of the smaller of those two places. And that lets us construct the similarity indexes for every pair of municipalities. More precisely, just to give you a very quick example, say if we have these 5 municipalities that we have here, A, B, C, D, and D, where the area in the left column of those little boxes represent how many workers live in these locations, and the little arrows represent the commuting flows. We can see that, for example, municipality A and municipality B are linked by one commuting flow that goes from B to A. That commuting flow is of mass 1. The smaller of these two places also has mass 1. So then the dissimilarity index is 1 minus 1 over 1, which is equal to 0. So these two places are very linked together, according to the dissimilarity index. In the second bottom part of the diagram, on the left, we have C, D, and D that have also similar migration flows, similar commuting flows. But in this case, if you look at D and E, D has mass 4 of workers, E has mass 3 of workers, and they only share a commuting flow of mass 1, which is signaled in this little blue arrow that I have on the left. In that case, the commuting flow is smaller relative to the size of the smallest of these two places compared to the previous example. So these two places are less linked. What the algorithm does is it sets a bound, a cutoff of the similarity, such that clusters that are below that level of the similarity get grouped together. And that's what I'm illustrating here in these brackets over here. So if we set a certain dissimilarity level, given what we have calculated, A and B would be grouped together, C and D would be grouped together, and E would be on its own. So all this just to explain how we arrived to this definition of local labor markets, which are grouped municipalities. To give you an example, this is a map of Mexico, where the lighter borders represent borders between municipalities, and the more cyan colored borders represent borders between local labor markets. And so local labor markets are really just tend to be collections of geographically proximal municipalities. We calculate a few metrics about this definition that we built, and they are quite encouraging. We compare our definitions to a previously existing definition of commuting zones published in a paper by Blythe and co-authors. And I don't want to necessarily go into the details of all of the diagnostics that we make, but our local labor market definitions tend to be more balanced in the sense that our median municipality tends to have our median local labor market tends to have 2 municipalities grouped together, while the alternative definition tends to leave lots of municipalities kind of as their individual own local labor markets, and then group some places into really large local labor markets. We calculate also, for example, in this second to last row, what's the average share of commutes that originate in a local labor market that remain within that local labor market. And we find that in our definition, this is over 90%, while in this alternative definition is about 83%. And also some other metrics are also quite encouraging. So we are confident in kind of applying this definition that we have built. With this definition in hand, we now have a mapping of municipalities to local labor markets that lets researchers essentially merge any data at a municipal level into our mapping of municipalities to local labor markets to generate local labor market level variables, which then allow a study of local labor markets. This is what I illustrate in this little diagram that I have in the bottom part of this slide, where, say, if we have informality rates for municipalities, and our mapping that is illustrated in the rightmost column. In in that table, we can collapse our database to now have local labor market level variables. And this is what we do. Using that as a starting point, we provide harmonized census microdata from 1990 on, along with local labor market identifiers for each data point, to give researchers resources to perform whatever analysis they have in mind. And in particular, I'll give you now a few details about the database. So the databases gather public census microdata for the censuses of 1990, 2000, 2010, 2015, and 2020, and harmonize a large set of variables that have been covered in those censuses. These individual level variables include, for example, demographics, education, and labor market variables that are of particular interest to us, right? Including employment status, wages, commute times, and health coverage, which lets us determine who is an informal worker and who is not. We also have information on housing units that these individuals are in, that include construction and ownership data, so materials, flooring, what services they have access to, and also some characteristics of the household, including what assets they have. Of course, the point is just to provide the researchers with resources to perform whatever data processing they need to address the research question, but we also provide local labor market level aggregates of some variables that we think are likely to be useful among these overall population for all of these years, employment, wages, and some measures of social vulnerability, mortality, as well as informality rates and residual wages, which I will discuss slightly in a moment. For more academic audiences or a kind of more academic-minded researchers more into the labor economics literature, we also provide Bartik shocks, which are commonly used as shocks to local labor demand, and are useful to identify a number of parameters and to simulate a number of natural experiments. These are constructed based on employment shares by industry at the local labor market level, which we provide, and the growth rates at the industry level, which we also provide. So all of these data resources are available to the research community, again, with the aim to promote the study of the Mexican labor market, and they can be found in this QR that is right here, and that also is kind of distributed kind of around the room, so that some of these QR codes were actually in the seats, and you can just scan these that are on the sides of the room if you're interested in accessing the webpage. And if you just Google, of course, like Mexico, Bank of Mexico, local labor markets, you'll reach them as well. This is what the web page looks like. We are interested in making the resources available to a large group of researchers. So the web page and the documentation are available in English as well as in Spanish. The data labels are only in Spanish, which is what it says here, but any researcher can perfectly use the data. So now I'll just spend a bit of time going through two applications that we have already used this data for. First, I'll go over kind of a general overview of what local labor markets have looked like between 1990 and 2020, which is the period that our data covers. And then I'll show you an estimation that is typical at the local labor market level, which is the inverse elasticity of labor supply. That's a bit of a mouthful, but maybe if you've come across labor economics, that's a very, very important parameter to understand the effects of both monetary, fiscal, development policy. All right. So, and by the way, maybe as also a motivating fact, I think you'll find it interesting that the trends in the Mexican labor market are quite different in the relative to the US trends in the labor market, as you see. So over this period, Mexico has seen an increase in the labor supply, meaning the amount of people that are available to work. Here I'm showing you swarm plots, where each little dot is a local labor market. and where the columns are years. And they show that as the years have gone by, the working age to population ratios have been increasing since the 1990s. This is, of course, true both for males and for females. Although you might actually see that there's like a little bit of maybe quote unquote mass missing from the top part of the male distribution, which we think is due to migration mostly into the US. At the same time, of course, employment to population ratios have been increasing because there's more working age people, but also working age women have been entering the labor force in larger numbers. So here I'm showing you again swarm plots of employment to population ratios that show that for men, these ratios have been more or less stable, maybe with a slight upward secular trend over this period, but have grown quite dramatically for women, especially after 1990. Now, in an environment where the quantity of employment is increasing, where the supply of employment is increasing, wages tell a story of whether labor demand is able to keep up. So to the extent that labor demand manages to grow slightly faster than labor supply, then we will have rising wages. And to the extent that labor demand grows more slowly than labor supply, then wages will tend to decrease. And so that's kind of a story that we see throughout the study period. Here I'm showing you density plots of the distribution of local labor market level wages. And I'm highlighting with vertical lines the medians, and also with at the left the 10th percentile, and on the right the 90th percentile of the distribution of local labor markets. And so a few things kind of pop out. So for example, if you look at maybe male labor, male wages first, you can see that they do move around over the decades, and this actually responds to kind of aggregate macroeconomic events that have been happening over this period. So between 1990 and 2020, you can see that the distribution shifts left. And we think that's partly a consequence of the peso crisis, which was a kind of large aggregate negative shock to Mexico. But at the same time, is the moment when NAFTA is coming into effect. So you'll see in a minute when I show you regional heterogeneity that NAFTA did have some perceivable positive effects in some local labor markets. Recovering from that shock from 20 to 2010, again, looking at the males, you can see that now the distribution shifts right. That's kind of just because of the natural growth process of Mexico. But that's also a period when both the China shock and the global financial crisis happen. And you again see some, I'll point out some regional effects when I get to that. And after that, we see a little bit more of a steady distribution. After that, as shocks kind of become smaller. So essentially, the story that we see here is that as labor supply is increasing, labor demand sometimes manages to keep up and sometimes does not. But also notice that for Mexico being a middle-income country, we don't see kind of any strong marks of convergence, meaning that it's not like productivity is increasing to the degree of making the overall distribution shift to the right. So there is some stagnation. Now, there have been some structural changes. Skilled employment has been increasing. Here, I'm defining skilled employment as a person with high school or more. And you can see that in the distribution of the skill employment relative to the total employment over the years has become a lot more dispersed. So, you know, there's maybe in the 1990s, there was only one, say, Mexico City, where lots of very educated people kind of clustered. But as the years have gone by, there's more and more of this skilled employment. Now, you might think that this could be related. By the way, there's something that I didn't point out very, very clearly here, but it's very important. Going back to the distributions of local labor market level wages, notice that while there is some stagnation in the overall distribution, the left tail of the wage distribution, especially for males, has been shifting to the right slightly. So this increase in skill employment that we see here is a possible explanation because skilled people tend to earn more. And so one basic thing that we want to test is whether the inequality in wages has been decreasing only because of changes in the composition of employment, or because of other factors more related to maybe demand or supply. And so here what I'm showing you are some metrics of inequality in the distribution of local labor market residual wages. And what residual wages are wages where we have netted out the effects of education and of age. So to the extent that education increases, residual wages in principle should not increase on their own. And what we see here, focusing first on the male wage distribution across local labor markets, is that especially this green line that represents the bottom tail inequality has been decreasing throughout. So reflecting this increase in wages in the left tail of local labor markets, and signaling some amount of convergence, at least within local labor markets in Mexico. And also notice that this is not the case necessarily for females, where these measures of local labor market level inequality have been more stable. There's a lot of regional heterogeneity in Mexico. Regions are quite different. And so this overall variation that we see in wage levels actually masks a lot of regional level variation. So I'll turn into that now. And to that end, I will rely on Bank of Mexico's definition of regions, where the two that I want to highlight are the northern region, which are all the states that border the US. And these states are characterized by a much more export-oriented economy, where export manufacturing composes an important amount of the distribution of labor, and that tends to be higher income. Then you have the north central and central regions that tend to be more balanced, more towards manufacturing to some extent, agriculture, services. And then you have the southern region that has traditionally, historically, had lower incomes and depended more on revenue from tourism and oil relative to the other regions. So now I'm showing you again the evolution of average wages for the national distribution of local labor markets, and just for local labor markets in the north. And here notice that between 1990 and 2000, there's a significant drop in average wages in the national distribution. Again, because of this simultaneous shock to the whole country in the 1994 peso crisis, to some extent. But notice that in the north, the drop is much more muted. We attribute this to the fact that NAFTA kicked in exactly around the time that the peso crisis happened at the end of 1994. And so the drop in wages in the north is much softer because there's a simultaneous positive labor demand shock that's hitting this region to a larger extent than other regions. The north is more exposed to shocks coming from the US, whether they are positive or negative. So notice that at the national level, between 2000 and 2010, there's a quite robust increase in wage at the national level, but that increase instead is a lot more muted in the north, and we attribute some of that to the greater exposure of the north to the consequences of the global financial crisis. That was an important drop in labor demand coming from the US. The central and the north central region, as I said, are kind of more diverse and more closely aligned to the national trends. And instead, we have the South that has lagged behind historically. And so this kind of goes back to the point Professor Hanson was making, that there's a very important kind of remaining issue of figuring out what are policies to bring these places back to the kind of levels that we would expect if there was convergence. But do notice that between 2000 and 2010, wages in the southern region did increase by a larger amount than the national, and we attribute some of that to record oil prices that were recorded kind of around that decade. As I mentioned before, the share of skilled employment in total employment had been increasing throughout. And so then looking at the skill premium, meaning the extra wage that a skilled person gets relative to a non-skilled person, it's important to figure out whether the relative demand for skill is growing faster or slower than the relative supply of skill. And so focusing on the time after 2000, you can see that there's like a pretty marked negative secular trend in the skill premium, which means that the relative supply of skill is growing faster than the relative demand. Otherwise, this skill premium would have increased to a larger degree. Also notice that there's, again, regional heterogeneity. The labor demand that is stronger in the north tends to be unskilled, and that means that the skill premium in the northern region tends to be lower than in other regions, mostly throughout the period after which NAFTA has been in effect. So just to kind of take stock of these descriptives, from 1990 to 2020, we see that employment increased steadily, especially among women, and that the skill ratio rose. Over that period, wages varied around their 1990 levels, and the skill premium eroded. So this kind of leads us to our main reading of kind of these big trends in local labor markets. That is that there have been countervailing changes in labor supply and demand growth, but an increase in the relative supply of skilled labor. And also there's this puzzling but very interesting decrease in inequality, especially on the lower tail of the distribution, even after we account for the secular increase in schooling. So that's been one application, and then the second application is a little bit more in the weeds of labor economics, but we think it's very important, and that is estimating the labor supply elasticity. So this is a super important parameter for policy design. If you recall your Econ 101 classes, the labor supply elasticity is the percentage increase in employment when you have a 1% increase in wages, right? So I see lots of nods in the audience, so good for Econ 101. And this, despite being such a simple concept, is super important for policy, for instance, in inflation determination, to the extent that the labor supply curve is more elastic. That means that demand shocks are going to be accommodated more as employment growth than as wage increases, and that means that it's less likely that demand shocks translate to increases in wages that then pressure the costs of firms. Otherwise, you might be more concerned that demand shocks can translate to inflationary pressures. For development policy, it's also very important because this parameter helps determine the job creation, helps determine the effects of a local policy that aims to increase labor demand. So just to give you an example of that, suppose that you have a world here illustrated on the left diagram where the labor supply is more inelastic, and you have a world where it's more elastic that I'm illustrating here on the right. And you subject both of these worlds to the same labor demand shock, meaning it could be anything, right? It could be like any place-based policy, a decrease in local taxes, investment, government expenditure of any kind that's localized, that would translate to a demand shock. To the extent that the labor supply is more inelastic, this demand shock is going to translate to a larger extent as an increase in the wages of existing workers, and not so much as the creation of new jobs, which is what I am illustrating here, kind of in that little bracket in the bottom, right? Those are the jobs that are created in the inelastic case. And instead, you can see that kind of going from the equilibrium of the lower level of demand to the equilibrium of the higher level of demand, wages increased a lot and not that many jobs were created, right? So maybe if you are interested in the extensive margin of the labor market, creating more jobs, this is not great news. On the other hand, if you find that labor demand is more elastic, then that means that the main effect when you shock a location with labor demand is going to be employment growth. So really important to know kind of what this is. And the way we do this is with a kind of microeconomic framework where we want to estimate this equation that we have here, where in fact I switched the sides of the equation. So our outcome variable is wage growth, and our independent variable is employment growth. And what we are after is that parameter beta there, right? As long as wage growth is in percentage terms, that beta is the inverse labor supply elasticity. Now, this equation has an error term that is possible, that is likely to be correlated with the outcome, meaning that if we just run this regression in the raw data, we're not going to capture the labor supply elasticity. We're going to capture some mixture of the labor supply and the labor demand elasticity. So what we need, following kind of the basic insights of like identification in kind of these partial equilibrium models, what we need is a demand shock that serves to some extent as a natural experiment, where we keep labor supply fixed and we shock locations with different levels of labor demand, as I illustrate in this little diagram here. So if demand goes from the kind of straight line to the dotted line, and labor supply stays the same, that lets us trace out the shape of the labor supply curve, which in other words is just telling us what is the slope of that curve, which in other words is just the labor supply elasticity. The estimation of this kind of this intuition, the way it usually gets done in practice is using shift share instruments, which simply means that you take advantage that similar local labor markets might be exposed to differing degrees to the same demand shocks at the industry level. So in the case of Mexico, for instance, if the US begins to demand a lot of car parts, that demand shock in the aggregate is going to hit local labor markets that are already specialized in car parts to a larger degree than places that are less specialized in car parts, right? And so that gives us some variation or a natural experiment that lets us kind of estimate this elasticity. These demand shocks are called usually shift share instruments or Bartik shocks. And they're called instruments because in the econometrics, what we do is an instrumental variable strategy, right? So I won't go into the weeds of that, but essentially we need to calculate these labor demand shocks, and we simply do it as I just described. So for each local labor market, we calculate to what extent each of their we calculate a weighted average of the growth rates of the industries in that local labor market. There have been some methodological advances that tell us how to do these regressions kind of in a way where the inference is correct. The fact that different local labor markets are exposed to the same shocks, but to different degrees, also means that local labor markets are not completely independent, which means we need to be careful about the way we do inference and testing. And so we take advantage of these kind of new techniques to be careful about that. And for this exercise, we just focus on male labor supply. We check that diagnostics are as they should. The first thing you want is that your instrumental variable is positively correlated with your independent variable. We find that is the case. That's what I'm showing here in this table over here. And then we also, since we are emulating a natural experiment, since we are emulating an experiment, we just want to make sure that places that have larger values of the shock are otherwise comparable, right? So we also kind of have some balance tests where we find that local labor markets are comparable kind of in their wage levels, in their poverty rates, independently of the level of the shock that they receive. And jumping into the results, what we find is that the estimated inverse labor supply elasticity is around 1.4, which puts male labor supply elasticity in Mexico in the inelastic range. And this is very close to the estimates for the US that this paper by Aldeco and co-authors find. The implied labor supply elasticity, which is just the inverse of this 1.4, says that a 1% increase in male wages increases male employment by 0.69. So again, larger effects on wages than on employment. And these results are statistically significant, being careful about how we are doing inference here. So the takeaway is that male labor supply in Mexico is inelastic. The effect of demand shocks on men is somewhat slanted towards wages. And the implication is that most of the effect of these kinds of policies that I described before shows up as increases in the wages of existing jobs rather than as new jobs. And again, this can be changes in labor demand because of exports, localized public spending, or other place-based policies. And so kind of the question that remains now is, okay, so maybe employment is not shifting that much, but maybe these jobs are becoming more formal, for example, or women are entering the labor force to a larger degree. And so those are questions that we are still aiming to answer. And another basic question is, to what extent these employment effects that we find are due to migration, right? If you are doing a localized policy, but those jobs are just getting filled with outside people that are coming to fill them, then maybe you're not changing kind of the outcomes of people that were already living there that much. So that's it for me. So I guess the takeaway is that wages and employment, again, are determined at the level of the local labor market. And thanks to this project that Professor Hanson and Chiquiar started, we are now able to do this kind of analysis also for Mexico. We have published these databases that we encourage you to use. And again, we hope this is an interesting point of comparison relative to the trends that are observed in US labor markets, right? That instead have tended, as I understand, to become more unequal and where the skill premium has actually increased a lot. So that's it for me, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was fantastic. Gave us a great understanding of how you need to stay up here.
I need to stay up there.
Yeah, you're still on.
I am still on, yes, you're right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of back and forth to talk about the way in which, thinking about the ways in which these data have been used in Mexico versus being used in the United States, and we'll open to the audience questions, and then we'll go to Danielle's presentation. So the first question, so you're at the Banco de México, you're at Mexico Central Bank.
Yeah.
And so my question is going to be about how deeper understanding of regional labor markets affects the conduct of monetary policy, which is supposed to be about aggregates, but aggregates are aggregates of what's happening at the local level. And for context, in economics, the first paper to really kind of put local labor markets on the table was in 1986 by Robert Topel, a labor economist at the University of Chicago, in which he said, we can study local labor markets. It doesn't really matter because labor is so mobile across places that these shocks get distributed around. We spent the next 30 years figuring out that it wasn't really right. That labor isn't, that labor is mobile, but labor is not mobile in response to shocks in a way that makes regions immune to variations that target them. And so we deepened that understanding over the course of decades, and it's filtered into policy more slowly than one might think. But when we think about monetary policy, it's a challenge, because what is monetary policy supposed to do? In the United States, you have the dual mandate of maintaining inflation at low levels, 2%, or whatever it will be in the future, and then while paying attention to unemployment. Now, the thing about unemployment is any shock that is going to affect the aggregate economy is going to affect some places more than other places. And what we haven't done in terms of policy, or we've done quite little, is to think about tuning policy responses to variation in those business cycle conditions. So in the US, the other policy tool that we have to deal with kind of increases in unemployment is unemployment insurance. And we actually have built into federal policy triggers which allow more generous unemployment insurance in states in which unemployment goes up by more, but we never use it. And so we treat the US as though it's an aggregate labor market, despite the fact that some of the best research about regional economies is happening in the US Federal Reserve. So now turning to the Mexican context, you all had the research group at the Banco de México is exceptional, had exceptional leadership under Danielle for the better part of 2 decades. help us understand the way in which this regional understanding is informing the way how policy is being conducted.
Yeah. So first, and I should have mentioned this at the very start of the talk. None of the things that we say correspond to the official position of Bank of Mexico at all. So this is all just research that is conducted by us. But yes, so going to on the question of the regional aspect, that's something that I, as part of the regional team in Bank of Mexico, have struggled over the years. And so what I notice is that kind of the regional aspect kind of fleshes out what is going on in the aggregates. So when you take any aggregate indicator and you break it up as we did here, so by regions, using your kind of priors about what makes each region different, the heterogeneity that you find in the disaggregated regional patterns make you have like some idea of what is behind the overall aggregate. So for example, I don't know, the recovery, there was a very strong recovery in employment in the second part, like after the pandemic, 2022, 2023, there was a very strong recovery in employment, right? And exceptionally strong. And when we go in and look at the regional breakdown of that, we see that, for example, the South region had a particularly strong kind of employment creation going on. And when you see that as a Mexican, you immediately figure out that's because there's these super targeted investments that are going on in the South, building infrastructure, building a refinery, building a train. So kind of that immediately tells you, so maybe this is not necessarily, not all of this is coming from like maybe an aggregate source, right? There's some really targeted things that are coming kind of from there. So that maybe is the first, and in the day-to-day of the kind of conduct of policy making, of trying to read the indicators and inform the decisions of the board, I think that's kind of our role. It's like bringing in kind of more micro components to the reading of the aggregates. And maybe Daniel has a...
You can talk about the way the Banco de México surveys.
Yeah, and this is also true. So this is more, so we also take very much to heart that there's a lot of heterogeneity in Mexico. And so there's a program where we actually survey, we have interviews with stakeholders and firm owners from each region in each sector, which helps us again to flesh out kind of what is going on in the data. And it's super useful because when you see an aggregate, when you see a particular change in a particular policy relevant, whatever variable, knowing that, like knowing what the kind of local stakeholders said, you get a prior about what is going on, and that's super useful for the reading. That would be one. And the second is that there's also regional heterogeneity in the effects, in the characteristics of these markets, right? So just to give you an example, in a work that I'm doing now, I look at how the Phillips curve, which relates unemployment to inflation, is different, has a different slope in places that have different economic characteristics in the local labor markets. And so, for example, something that we notice is that places that have larger shares of their population receiving transfers, either as remittances or as government transfers, tend to have steeper Phillips curves, meaning that when you get a demand shock, it tends to translate more to prices than if it was flatter, right? And so there is a dimension of regional heterogeneity that does matter. Because a lot of these policies, for example, transferences, are geographically pretty concentrated. So the question is then, how do you weigh different regional responses into your aggregate monetary policy? And I think that's a challenging thing. I've always been curious to ask that to someone at the ECB, for example, because it's the same problem that we have. Well, yeah, that would be.
So I have two more questions before we open it up. The first of those is building on what you just said about the way in which you're deepening your understanding of regional variation in what's going on. One of the things that's happened in the United States in terms of research on regional economies is a lot of it was instigated by the regional Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia has had one of the strongest concentrations of regional economists going back decades. The Federal Reserve Bank here in Boston has been central in thinking about and experimenting with, to the extent that the Federal Reserve can, in different approaches to assessing local economic development. And you see similar things at the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City and so forth. So in the Mexican context, you have a single central bank, not regional offices, but you have a bunch of strong governors. And those governors presumably care a lot about what you do. So what can you say about the way in which the conduct of monetary policy intersects with the way in which the state governments pursue their economic policy?
So it's true that in Mexico, state governments are pretty strong, but as far as I know, they have very little input to, and there's very little communication between them and the Mexican Central Bank. What we do, the communications that are there are between the Mexican Central Bank and its regional offices. So there are regional offices in Monterrey to cover the north region, in Guadalajara to cover the center north, Mexico City covers the center, and the southern delegation in Merida. Each of those offices has connections to, again, like the business community and other stakeholders, not political, but economic stakeholders. And their inputs are really important to get a sense of kind of what things might be changing. So again, it's not like they are, so it's true. All of these regional offices are strictly dependent on the central bank. It doesn't have the structure of the Fed where like the regional banks kind of, they can even, like the regional governors can be, I think, people from like the private sector or something like that. Everybody who works at Bank of Mexico is just like a public servant. And that means that we tend to be insulated from most of these kind of more political things, but we do care a lot about listening to kind of the stories, the narratives that people say. Because a lot of times there's no data to show you something that there's no data to give you an explanation about something that you see is going on. We can talk about remittances, for example, where kind of transit migration is a big new topic, where transit migrants get remittances sent to them from family members or friends in the US. And that has changed the way the geographical distribution of remittances happens in Mexico, right? We have no way of really knowing kind of how big of a phenomenon that is until we go and talk to a person that has contacts in Tapachula or in other parts of Chiapas, and they tell you, yeah, there's a lot of migrants that got stuck kind of in this place because the Trump policies didn't let them ask for asylum or kind of continue their migration process or travel. And so they're here and they clearly consume without working. So it has to be that they are getting remittances from somewhere. So again, it's just kind of the bank making an effort of like building a network of connections with kind of like economic stakeholders and hearing from them.
So my last question is about, as you think about margins of adjustment, central banks focus on kind of inflation, unemployment, tells a very incomplete story about what's going on in the economy, and regions give us insight into this. In the U.S. context, unemployment is imperfectly informative because it's telling you about people who are looking for work but who can't find it. It's not telling you about people who've
exited the labor force entirely.
Yep. We've got about 15% of the U.S. population that lives in local labor markets in which the employment rate for prime age workers without a college degree is less than 80%. So it's just shocking by historical norms. And so then that's this extra feature that you have to be thinking about. In the Mexican context, what I've learned from your work and the work of the Banco de México is how much variation there is in informality in the country.
Yep.
And you think about joblessness as being this extra margin we need to worry about in the US. Informality is this extra margin that we need to worry about in the Mexican context. So you can tell us just a little bit about what you've learned about informality, its regional variation, and contributions to its shifts.
Yeah, so informality is a super deep, complicated topic. we were talking with Jorge recently that if you want to give an overview of the Mexican local labor market, of the Mexican labor market in the aggregate, you have to talk about informality for sure. But it's kind of hard to get a real handle on kind of what do you want to do about it in terms of policy. Is it something that you want to, is it coming from the fact that the formalization is difficult, or is it coming from the fact that simply productive paid work is not attractive or not available for these workers, right? And so they use informality as an outside option. I think there's like, we definitely have to like improve our understanding of that. What is obvious is that informality varies a lot among locations, as you say, and that matters for all sorts of things. So Jorge has worked, for example, on how the degree to which cities, to the extent that cities are bigger, you find that labor market matching is better, right? So it's easier for a firm to get a worker that is really productive for them. That process of matching breaks down in places with very high informality. So we know for sure that's something that has to be addressed. Like it has consequences for the function of the labor market, and not just for like the individuals that are informal at a given moment, right? Informality also matters for the Phillips curve slope, for example. Places with more informality have steeper slopes, and we think that is because there's less supply of qualified workers to deal with like a local labor demand shock. In places I've studied, for example, measures of labor market power, and we find that also in places where informality is greater, formal employers seem to have more labor market power, right? Maybe because, again, it's not so easy for formal workers to substitute to a different formal job, which means that these kind of valuable jobs are harder to find, and the employers in the aggregate kind of manage to mark down wages more because of that. So I guess our approach is more like trying to understand, given that this thing is so important to the function of the labor market, what its consequences are, but we have to still kind of flesh out what we think is the kind of necessary policy to really bring informality down, which has not been the case over the decades over this period.
Great. Let's open it up to the floor for questions, please. Yes. If you'll hold on for 1 second, we have folks listening online, so we're going to hand you a mic.
So I'll ask the first one, then I'm thinking about the second one. I kept thinking about younger generations and pipeline feeding into labor markets. And for instance, advanced manufacturing needs STEM skills. And so I kept thinking about that part of it in terms of the training that is needed to upskill next generations, but also those that are working in traditional manufacturing, and how that, and is there a policy even in Mexico at that macro level around STEM education, for instance, and again, trickling back to younger generations, K through 12, feeding into labor markets. The second one, because I have my nose in a lot of pots, including criminology, I kept thinking about the drug trafficking, and that's informal economy.
Sure.
And very attractive.
Sure.
For a whole bunch of different reasons. And I don't know how you get information about that, and how to make work more attractive that would prevent that entree into that field, if you will. So those are the two things I was thinking about.
Yeah, so I guess the answer to the first question is that, and Daniel is going to talk a lot about that, to the extent that the manufacturing jobs exist and have grown in Mexico, they tend to be lower skilled. So it's kind of the typical story of maybe simple manufacturing tasks getting done by Mexicans whose wages are lower, right? Relative to US wages. And that has been the case, especially after NAFTA came into effect in 1994. So to my knowledge, there's not a lot of kind of emphasis on building towards more advanced STEM skills at like a more global Mexico level, but there should, I guess, because these are productive jobs. That goes back again to the point I made about the distribution of wages. Being pretty stable, like if productivity and education was really making wages go up in some secular way, you would expect the distribution of local labor market distribution of wages across local labor markets to start shifting to the right little by little, and we don't really see that. So that's, I think, like a challenge for to have more productive jobs for sure. On the second part of criminality, it's true, and so it's very hard to measure. You can't. It's very hard to measure. I know of some research that might interest you, and I'll just say a couple of things about them. There's a paper that was published, I don't remember if Nature or Science, that tried to back out kind of from the operations of the cartels, how many people died, kind of the average age of the people that were in them, how many people must be employed in, like, let's say, illegal drug trafficking related activities in a given year. And I'm not sure how precise it is, but they said it was like among the large employers in the aggregate in Mexico, right? I don't remember if like the sixth largest employer or something like that. Of course, like the distribution of employment kind of drops off very quickly, right? So again, but in the aggregate, it's likely to be important. It's also important for distribution of employment in other ways. Like my PhD thesis was about the effects of local homicides and how that distorts migration between locations. So when homicides increase in one local labor market, skilled workers, both unskilled and skilled workers, but skilled workers to a larger degree, stop immigrating to those local labor markets, which means that over time, these places kind of have less of a supply of skilled work, right? And that makes sense, right? Like there are people that are already living there that have their lives. It's not like a place becoming more violent immediately means that everybody is going to leave, because again, there's frictions, right? So it's not like a place that gets marginally worse gets completely emptied out. But you see the composition of skill changing for sure, and that's also an important one. Yeah.
Great. Danny?
Continuing on skills, so I maybe we'll talk more about that also in the second section. But my intuition going to an old paper of Gordon's with Rob Feenstra is that you're right that the jobs in manufacturing in Mexico are less skilled and they pay substantially less than those in the United States, but within Mexico that they would be relatively skilled.
Yeah.
Now,
absolutely.
so that was the old paper, the Gordon's.
Yep.
But I was first, is that true? But also, but that the piece of evidence you provided, which puzzled me, is that in the North, the skill premium has not only has declined much more sharply, and now is actually as the lowest of all four regions.
Yeah.
Which goes against that presumption. So, so what's going on there?
So I think it's just that the skill premium is lower in the North simply because the returns to unskilled labor are larger, because there's this big source of labor demand for mostly unskilled workers, which is the export manufacturing sector.
But then
I'm going to speak a little bit about that. Yeah, actually, the kind of mechanism you're thinking. Going ahead, it's hard to compare the current environment from the one Gordon and Robert Feenstra studied, because that was the first stage of Mexico's trade liberalization in the late 80s. But NAFTA came afterwards. And according to the evidence I will present, NAFTA's consequences were more in line with what we see in these data that Lorenzo provided. For unskilled, yeah. At least given some definition of low-skilled individuals, maybe those
not the lowest skilled, but
nine or less schooling years, for example, which is not perfect, but we do have some evidence. In fact, going ahead a little bit, the nearshoring story was precisely the presumption was that we would observe something like some mechanism as the one you suggest. And that was our expectation, in fact, that there would be an increase in relatively higher skilled occupations. I'll show that we haven't seen that. But I think that's because it's still a very short-term phenomenon, what we have observed. Since the US-China trade war, Mexico started exporting more what it used to export and not necessarily coming into new industries that may be highly higher skill intensive.
Actually, already lives in Mexico.
Yeah, that would be my conclusion.
Time for one more question.
I wonder if you can make a comment as far as migration, the effect of the current policies in the United States about basically stopping immigration from Mexico and Latin America. What effect is going to have that on the markets and the labor market in Mexico?
Yeah, so that's maybe a little bit outside of the scope of this kind of specific local labor market story, but I can give you some insights that I have. And is that at least migration from Mexico to the US had been on a declining trend for a while, even before these policies kind of came into place. So maybe and also the flows, like the number of people in Mexico that migrate to the US and the return from the US to Mexico are very small relative to the stock of Mexicans in the US. And we think that these policies tend to affect the flows more than the stocks. So in the aggregate terms, we think whatever effects happen are not going to be, spectacularly crazy. One thing that we do see is that remittances have changed since Trump started enforcing a lot of these policies. You hear stories of workers, not wanting to necessarily work as much, so they have less income, or they don't want to risk going to somewhere to where they physically are kind of like vulnerable in order to send the money. So you see remittances shifting a little bit after kind of Trump started this to some extent, yeah. But we don't expect the effects to be spectacularly massive.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was an outstanding presentation. We really appreciate the back and forth on the questions.
Thank you very much.
We will switch to Daniel.
A ver si, porque no sé cómo me lo pusieron. Déjame pagarle.
Hello, folks. We're going to start with the second presentation. So please, everyone, come back to your seats. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Reimagining the Economy at Harvard Kennedy School, Gordon, Monse, and the Reimagining the Economy team for making this meeting possible. I also want to congratulate and thank Banco de Mexico's team, whose very hard work in the last couple of years made this project possible. As Lorenzo already described, the whole database and documentation about it are made publicly available by Banco de Mexico in their website, and the work of Banxico's team was fundamental to achieve this. So I want to thank them for all the hard work. So I'm gonna make a short presentation trying to illustrate the kind of uses that this database can be used for, focusing on trade-related shocks. It's not that the database is only useful for trade-related shocks, but most of the latest research I've been doing with some of my students is on trade-related issues. So I will illustrate with that. But as Lorenzo already spoke about it, it's clear that the database has much broader uses. Using this new database and the local labor market definitions just described by Lorenzo, I will provide new evidence using those data concerning the effects of the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s on wages, the skill premium, and growth, both from a geographical point of view and the local labor market responses. Then I'll speak a little bit about some research made with these data on the consequences on Mexico from the China shock. And finally, some research we've done concerning the effects on Mexico's labor markets of the US-China trade war. So going there, first speaking about the NAFTA, a lot of the initial literature that studied Mexico's trade liberalization tended to conclude that, if anything, the trade liberalization of Mexico led to an increase in the skill premium in the country, which is opposite to what the Heckscher-Ohlin model would predict. So many papers tried to explain why was that the case, what kind of mechanisms could have offset the effect that we would be expecting on the skill premium, a negative effect of trade, given Mexico's abundance in non-skilled labor, and so on. However, there's two issues with the initial literature, with some exceptions, but the literature did not analyze local labor markets separately. And second, most of the literature focused on the first stage of Mexico's trade liberalization, when Mexico opened up unilaterally against the whole world. It is with NAFTA when there was an additional effort of trade liberalization with specifically a couple of countries that are much more skill abundant than Mexico. So it is during this second stage when we should expect more clearly the Heckscher-Ohlin model to predict what would happen with Mexico's skill premium in that context. So given that, in an old paper I wrote almost 20 years ago, I analyzed the regionally heterogeneous effects of NAFTA on Mexico, and I found that indeed those regions that were more linked to the international economy, or specifically to the US, tended to exhibit a decrease in the skill premium as compared to the remainder of the country, which is something that Lorenzo illustrated some minutes ago. So I found that. However, the analysis, the empirical analysis I made was limited by the kind of data that at the time was available to do that. In particular, the theoretical argument of the paper I'm talking about had a very precise implication of the heterogeneity that we should observe across Mexico's regions. In particular, I won't go into the theoretical details, but in that paper, there's a simplification of a more general model by Tony Venables and Nuno Limao, who speak about the regionally heterogeneous impacts of trade. I did a simplification of that model for the case of Mexico, and the paper shows that there's 3 distinct regions within Mexico in terms of the way they interact with the rest of with the U.S. and the way they react to trade shocks. In particular, there's a small region in the region with the U.S. border, which we could call an export processing zone, which according to the theoretical model endogenously appears as a consequence of the existence of transport costs. In particular, the idea of the model is that given the existence of transport costs, the net price of exportable goods relative to importable goods tend to decrease with distance to the US. That is, exporters earn a lower net price if they are farther away from the border, and importers can charge a higher price of the imported good as we move away from the border. So these changes across space in prices leave the region most closer to the border with the US to endogenously become an export processing zone where there is a full specialization on the exportable goods and the importable goods are used as intermediates. And that's something that anecdotally we know, given the existence of this maquiladora corridor in the border region. That's one zone when, given that there's full specialization in exportable goods, any trade shock has the same consequences on the prices of both types of labor, unskilled and skilled labor, because you're only producing one good from a theoretical point of view. Then we move to another region where both goods are produced and traded. And so in that region, we do have heterogeneous kind of responses because both goods are traded and produced and traded. So there is where we should expect a decrease in the skill premium as a consequence of trade. And finally, there's an autarky zone, which obviously Mexico is not autarkic. That's a theoretical result. But the idea is that in this farther away zone from the border, the skill prices or the prices of inputs are determined basically by local conditions and not necessarily by trade shocks. So the theoretical model has that prediction, but I wasn't able to test it precisely because I had to use state level data, which is not necessarily the degree of regional disaggregation that I would like to have in order to be able to identify these regions more closely. But now having this database available, with one student of mine, Maria Solis, I started working on revisiting this model and trying to assess if geographically the predictions of the model were supported by the data or not. And what do we find? Going very fast. First of all, we do find that there's a negative correlation between the degree to which each labor market, which in these figures is represented by each of these bubbles. The size of the bubbles is the size of the local labor market according to the labor force. We see a negative correlation of the manufacturing to total employment and of the exportable to importable industries employment against distance to the US border. That is, according to the model and according to the data, regions that are closer to the United States are more specialized relatively in producing exportable goods relative to importable goods. That's also seen in a map form. Here we can see that manufacturing as a share of total employment and the exportable to importable employment ratio are large on the green areas, which comprise states in the northern part of the country. And there's some exporting industry also in the center, including Mexico City, Puebla, etc. However, we do find that the least exportable regions of the country are those in the south, for example. Here, this is more. This is even clearer because here I'm comparing the share of exportable to total employment in each local labor market, and we see that it's the north where we see this large concentration of exporters, also in the center. If we go to the change in local skill premia, assuming that each local labor market has its own skill premia, we find, again, the result that is similar to what Lorenzo said and what you asked. We find that, at least during the 90s, it is in the regions that are relatively closer to the US border where the skill premium rose the least, or relative to the rest of the country, it decreased in relative terms, which is the red and yellow zones. The regions within Mexico where the skill premium increased the most, according to these data, are in the southern part of the country. Trying to formalize that, we ran some very simple regressions. We're controlling for different local labor market features. We regressed the change in the skill premium in each local labor market against its distance to the United States. First, we made some groups of local labor markets in terms of their distance, and we used dummies for each one of these groups. And then we made a polynomial regression to try to allow for flexibility in the effects. And in both cases, we find that there is a very small region, very close to the US border region. In fact, it's not larger than 50 or 75 kilometers from the border, where the export processing zone, according to the model, is present. And that coincides with the region where most maquiladoras were located at the time being. Then we have the Hex-Cherolin zone, where there is a decrease in the skill premium as during the 90s. And then we have a very large zone where there are neither no significant changes or positive changes in the skill premium, but they are farther away from the border. In fact, the vertical line there represents where Mexico City is located in terms of its distance to the US. And we see that the skill premium increased, according to these data, it increased mostly in the southern region of the country, the farthest away region from the US border. Trying to go more into detail with these kind of mechanisms, and other work currently ongoing with another student, Pablo Diaz de Leon, we follow precisely Autor Dorn and Hanson's approach for the China shock, but to try to construct a measure of local labor market exposure to NAFTA in Mexico, using, again, the new local labor market database. And here, basically, I won't go into the econometric details, but we use a very similar measure as they use in terms of the degree of local exposure, to what degree each local labor market is exposed to the increase in exports to the United States during the 90s, after NAFTA came into effect, the increase in those exports by sector, and we apportion this increase in exports to each labor market according to the industrial composition within markets. And there's also endogeneity issues here. So we instrument this increase in the exposure of local labor markets to NAFTA. We instrument it with two instrumental variables that are computed, as in Topalova's paper, using tariff preference changes from Mexico to US imports and from US to Mexican exports to the US. That is, we use the bilateral decrease in tariffs with respect to most favored nation tariffs to instrument for the increase in exports. In fact, this is a more discussion that we're having, but it seems that also the import tariffs had a positive effect on employment. So we were saying this goes against the idea, but thinking it over, it is the case that during NAFTA, Mexico became very much vertically integrated with the United States. There was a lot of intra-industry trade. Mexico specialized in some processes. So in fact, there is some evidence that NAFTA lowered imported input costs by reducing the tariffs. So both instruments were useful for the regression analysis. And going very fast, we find interesting results, which tend to go in the direction of what Lorenzo showed and I said in a while, but with an interesting twist that some authors have mentioned, but not all of them. We find that indeed NAFTA increased average wages. That is, the local exposure to NAFTA led the most exposed regions or local labor markets to exhibit an increase in real wages relative to other less exposed regions. However, there's two margins. First, we see there is a decrease in the skill premium, which is again what you would expect given the Heckscher-Ohlin model. But we also find that it decreased the gender gap. That is, if we consider the gap between male and female workers' wages, what we find is that most of the effect is driven by the fact that NAFTA seems to have reduced the gender gap between, that is, it increased female wages relative to male wages. In unreported results here, but in this project, we did a lot of checks with more detailed data. We find that that's explained fully by unskilled female labor force. That is, what we're finding is that NAFTA led to a relative increase in unskilled female labor. So that's a little bit different from the basic idea, but it's very interesting. And there is some previous research that has found this result. In fact, there has been two hypotheses about that. The first hypothesis is that with higher competition, there's less degree of firms' power to discriminate. That's one hypothesis. But the second hypothesis that I think that is more supported by the evidence that has been published is that NAFTA led to upgrading of the technology of exporters and of new exporters in a Melitz type of model. And that has reduced the need for hard work, which is relatively more made by male workers. So in relative terms, the demand for unskilled female workers is the one that seems to have increased as a consequence of NAFTA. So that's something that deserves a lot of research for diverse reasons, but it's a result that we think it's especially interesting from this research. Another result that I want to highlight is that we also estimated with the use of this local labor market database and matching it to municipality level data on the economic censuses and GDP data at the state level, we estimated the local labor market GDP for 1993 before NAFTA and for 2000. After 6 years of NAFTA and before the China's entrance to the WTO, and we tried to assess whether the exposure to NAFTA had a significant effect on GDP growth. And we find strong results that in fact, those local labor markets more exposed to NAFTA did have an increase in their growth rate, both in manufacturing and to a smaller extent, but still positive, in non-manufacturing GDP. That is, there seems to be some feedback to non-manufacturing. But importantly, we find also weaker, but still significant results that per capita GDP increased in those local labor markets more exposed to NAFTA. An interesting result, maybe this is too preliminary, so I want to state it with care. But it seems that with this new data, we are finding evidence on convergence across Mexican local labor markets. Most of the literature after NAFTA has found that there was divergence between Mexico's regions, including work I made myself 20 years ago. But that work used state-level data, which again is very limited in terms of its regional disaggregation. Using local labor markets, we're now finding convergence. That is, the controlling for other factors, poorer local labor markets seem to be growing at a slightly higher rate than richer local labor markets. But that's controlling for other things, and in particular, controlling for exposure to the NAFTA shock. Now, going a little bit faster, Astrid and Tevi, another student of mine, used this database to try to assess the labor market consequences of the China shock on Mexico. So she again relied on the approach of the China shock paper by Dorn and Hanson, but she constructed two measures of Mexico's exposure to the China shock. A direct measure to what extent each local labor market in Mexico was exposed to increased imports of Chinese goods by Mexico, and an indirect effect through the U.S. labor market, the U.S. Goods market. In particular, to what extent the increased share of Chinese imports in the U.S. displaced Mexican exports to the U.S. of the same kind of goods. So she computed these two measures. She used an instrumental variables approach similar to Dorn and Hanson, using other countries to identify the China productivity shock without the estimates being affected by local demand shocks. And she finds negative effects on employment and negative effects on real wages. However, here, what we see is, again, the shock seems to have been larger in terms of wage decreases for the least educated individuals. That is, those that have less schooling had relatively higher decreases in their wage levels than more educated people. So this is similar to what seems to have been observed in the US, no? As a consequence of the China shock. And finally, the US-China trade war. And here's where the discussion that you mentioned, Danny, may be especially relevant. When the US-China trade war started in 2018, 2019, in Mexico, there was a presumption that this would lead to nearshoring of Chinese activities towards Mexico. And in particular, there is a lot of evidence, Pablo Fagelbaum and his co-authors and others, Alfaro and Shore, for example, they have found that the US-China trade war led to many bystander countries to benefit from the trade war. That is, for example, Mexico and Vietnam were able to substitute for the decrease in Chinese imports to the US in the goods that were affected by the tariffs that US imposed. So there was a presumption that there would be a positive effect on Mexico's labor markets. And furthermore, using the kind of arguments you mentioned, there was a presumption that if China was relatively specialized in relatively higher skill intensive processes than Mexico, then the processes that would come from China to Mexico would lead to an increase in the relative demand of skilled labor in Mexico, using the same kind of arguments as your paper with Robert Finstra. So we tried to test that because that's one hypothesis. A second hypothesis is that we would again see something very much reminiscent of the Heckscher-Ohlin model, in which the US-China trade war would lead to a decrease in the skill premium. So what we did was to try to answer that question empirically, First, we used municipalities as our measure of local labor markets because we wanted to use timely data on wages. In the database that we have right now at Banco de México, it stops in 2020. So we used 2023 data from ENOE to compute the effect on wages. However, then I constructed the data at a local labor market level based on the definitions that Lorenzo said. And along with another student, Ginebra Garcia Moreno, we did this research in which we tried to answer what was the direction of the effect of the US-China trade war on Mexico's labor markets. First, we find a significant positive effect on manufacturing employment. That is, the regions or the local labor markets that were more exposed to increased exports to to the US as a consequence of the trade war, were regions where manufacturing employment increased most by a significant amount of 4.4%. And we also find some evidence, relatively weaker, but significant at that 10% level, that there was also a positive effect on overall wages. That is, those local labor markets more specialized in the goods that Mexico tended to increase its exports to the United States directly as a consequence of the trade war, exhibited a higher relative increase in wages. Going to the skill mix of employment and wages, we find again a negative effect on the skill premium and on the relative skilled labor employed in manufacturing. That is, the results, at least up to this point, seem to be relatively consistent with a Head-Sherolin kind of story in which Mexico and China produce relatively the same kind of unskilled labor intensive goods. And as China loses market share, Mexico gains market share in those kind of goods, leading to an increase in the relative demand for unskilled workers. So there's a discussion, we're having a discussion of why we did find these results, even though we expected the opposite. Maybe it's too short a time. Maybe for the full nearshoring story to evolve, we need Mexico to invest in new sectors, higher skilled ones. So maybe the story of nearshoring is a longer term story than a short term story in which a trade war leads in the first 2 or 3 or 4 years after the trade war, leads Mexico to expand its exports on sectors where it already was exporting. So that's the kind of insight we're trying to analyze, to what extent that's consistent with our results. So concluding, this was relatively shorter, concluding the results, as you said, seem to suggest that Head-Sherolin lives in Mexico. As you said, most of the evidence from these analyses tend to be consistent with the basic Head-Sherolin framework. With the use of regionally more disaggregated data, we find results that in some cases may challenge previous results, such as what I mentioned about convergence, regional convergence, and in some cases provide more robust evidence of results that have been published before. For example, Artecona and Cunningham had already published a paper in which they found that Mexico's trade liberalization reduced the wage gap, but the results, and they acknowledge it, were significant only at a 20% level. Our results are stronger. They are much stronger. And June and co-authors also provide evidence of what I mentioned about the skill upgrade, the technology upgrading in Mexican industries as a consequence of NAFTA, and how these led to an increase in the relative demand for unskilled females, which is consistent with the results that we have here and with what you can find in the database we are launching. So just to conclude, while I spoke about trade-related shocks, The database itself may be useful for many other kind of analysis. Some students are already working on it to try to analyze domestic migration, and others are using it to try to analyze the consequence of remittances of female labor supply. So there's a lot of work that can be done with this database. So thank you again. I think this is mine and this is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. I think you appreciate from the clarity of his presentation how good Daniel is in the classroom. He taught econometrics at ITAM for many, many years. I was marginally famous in Mexico because I had been Daniel's thesis advisor, and when I would go talk to Mexican policymakers, almost all of them had studied economics under Daniel. So in addition to his outstanding contributions to research and to the work at the central bank, you have many former students who've had a major role in Mexican economic policy. So before we open it up to general questions, I want to ask you just a couple of things as we try and then figure out kind of globalization's impact on Mexico and then reflect back on the expectations in 1994. I funded my dissertation by being a part-time consultant to Mexico's Ministry of Trade in 1990. And those were heady times in Mexico, and Mexico saw itself as becoming South Korea. And it was going to develop its own chaebol, and we were going to see explosive GDP growth. We did see explosive growth in exports, in export manufacturing, but as Lorenzo's work showed us before, the translation of that into wage growth has been modest, although we did ultimately see reductions in lower tail earnings inequality. So the work that you talked about here focuses on kind of a particular aspect of that globalization, which is the maquiladora role. And that's emblematic of the sort of plants you would find in border cities like Tijuana or Ciudad Juarez, where if you go there, you'll see lots of women working on the assembly floor. But then we have another type of manufacturing, which you would find in Querétaro with aerospace. Embraer has operations there. And then in automobiles, you go to Aguascalientes and Toyota and other entities there. Yes. So that's type 2. Mm-hmm. And then type 3 is on the services side. We have the major arrival of Walmart. We know from work of Ben Faber and co-authors that had impact on consumer prices and income distribution as a result. But it was also a big deal in terms of labor demand, because you're bringing in these new technologies and you're changing the nature of that employment. And then the other area of services that have been a big deal is in tourism. Mexico develops its touristic resources like no other country. When they're going to make a beach resort, they make a beach resort. It's going to have 150,000 tourists coming in every week. And that's transformed various different parts of the country. So we have a bit of research. Again, Ben Faber has looked at impacts of that touristic development on local economic activity. But as we take a step back and reflect on expectations, and we know what's happened in the aggregate in terms of earnings, yes. How do we think about the consequences of these other dimensions of globalization? What do we know? What do we don't know? What should we know?
Well, first of all, regarding the expectations of trade liberalization, and thinking possibly on NAFTA especially, maybe there was two sides and not a middle ground in terms of what people expected. There were people that were expecting negative effects in Mexico and in the United States. Remember the giant sucking sound story. And there were super optimistic expectations regarding that NAFTA itself would lead to convergence of Mexico to US wage levels and well-being. No? I think that both of them were not on target. First, because we shouldn't be expecting such negative effects as the most pessimistic ones. But the most optimistic ones were not taking into account that trade liberalization is only part of a more deep process of reconstructing an economy. And many things that Mexico needed, at least at that point in time, and some of them are still needed today, to boost even more the effects of trade liberalization on economic growth, were not there. Institutional factors, the lack of monopoly power in non-traded services. So the effect of NAFTA, although positive according to these estimates I just presented, was not relatively large. Was in the right direction, but it didn't change completely the structure of the Mexican economy. It did change it for certain regions, as you say. And from the 3 out of the 4 examples that you say, you're mentioning sectors that are known to be female labor intensive, with the exception of the aerospace and high-end manufacturing, which there we should see the data, but tourism is relatively female intensive. Maquiladoras are known to be female intensive, and that conforms with the data I presented. And the relatively lower end manufacturing are also, according to the evidence I mentioned, have shifted towards more female labor. Even the auto manufacturing sector in Mexico, it employs a lot of imported components. So the processes made in Mexico to build the cars are not very skill intensive. They use relatively unskilled labor. So in that sense, the story is not very linear in terms of high-end manufacturing, high-end skill demand, because Mexico has tended to specialize in processes, specific processes that may be relatively unskilled labor intensive, and imports a lot of inputs from higher skill abundant countries.
So this is going beyond the data, but just in thinking about development policy for Mexico, what you describe in terms of the way in which globalization has brought many less educated women into the labor force sounds a lot more like Bangladesh than like Korea in terms of the impact of globalization. Yet Mexico stands out for having many outstanding universities in terms of their engineering. So you think about the supply of skill at the technical end, it's there. And so this puzzle of what is missing to allow Mexico to be following more of the path of Korea or today Malaysia in terms of leveraging that engineering talent. And is it about the next tier of labor? Is it about or are just the Hexerline forces are so dominant?
No, I think that we should try to overcome that through policy in order to build up a country with higher value-added possibilities, And in that sense, let me go back. Just today, it's not a global environment very conducive to what I would like to say. But precisely the story of nearshoring was one possible avenue through that. However, in order to really leverage those opportunities and use relatively more skilled labor in relatively higher value-added industries or services for that matter, we need other things in the economy. First of all, we need an elastic supply of skilled labor. And even though we have universities, very high-end universities, it is the case that the degree of income the unequal income distribution in Mexico is such that it's still the case that even though it has improved, the share of people really ending a university degree is relatively small. It's not comparable to the United States. So even with the large labor force, the share of very skilled individuals with university degrees and so on is very small. So we do have a constraint there, in order to move into higher skill intensive industries. Second, I think, and this is a very personal opinion, but all the literature has found that these kind of industries where you can really boost growth tend to be industries where the goods that you produce are relatively custom-made or specialized, so that you have this need for a solid legal environment protecting contracts. You know, Nathan Noon's story or Levchenko's story that there can be comparative advantage or disadvantage in skill in this kind of specialized industries, such as semiconductors and so on, where if you don't have a very strong legal framework, there will be underinvestment because of the holdup problem. So in that sense, I believe that one of the main constraints that Mexico faces is that a legal framework or an institutional framework that is not necessarily conducive for investment in these sectors where you have more specialized kind of goods. So that may also answer why it's still a Hector story instead of a different kind of, yeah.
One comment on that before my last question, and that is when during the Biden administration, when regions that had one investment either in semiconductors or in building electric vehicles, what they invested in order to make those operations work wasn't training more engineers. It was training more advanced manufacturing workers in community colleges. So it was below the BA degree level. And that's a level of training that is even scarcer supply in Mexico, perhaps, than the college level.
Yeah, I agree.
So my last question is it's about thinking about the role of migration to the United States in the nature of labor market adjustment. Because in Lorenzo's finding inelastic labor supply, say, like, how can this be in a world where you have the migration option to the United States? And I think, as you rightly noted, Lorenzo, that era of mass migration ended around kind of 2006. It ended with the Great Recession and the global financial crisis. But then in the aftermath of that, we have all these people moving through Mexico. Are those migrants in transit? Are they not relevant for?
You mean the ones that are returning to Mexico?
The non-Mexicans traveling through.
Yeah.
Of which there have been, now those numbers are down substantially, but from first the Central Americans from the Northern Triangle, and then other countries from around 2010 to 2024, there were millions of people moving through the country. So as we think then about two parts, this transition from high migration pre-2006, which varied, as you know very well, differentially by state, because region in Mexico because of different connections to the United States, and then the movement of foreign nationals through the country on the way to the United States. What are your thoughts about the way in which those two migration events have affected the nature of labor market adjustment to globalization or other stuff?
The fact that net migration to the United States basically halted after 2006 or so may have had an effect. Maybe this database could be useful to try to assess more precisely the kind of effects that had. There is some research, but it's a little bit more focused on return migrants, which do find interesting results, which in a sense, it's not exactly what you're asking, because you're asking people who don't move, who would otherwise may have moved. I think that there are many factors that have influenced on that. That started with the global financial crisis, with the tightening of US migration policies. And right now, I don't have to say anything about the conditions right now to migrate to the US. So that may be some macro factors that affect, but we should also look at micro factors that have limited migration to the United States in the last couple of decades. So that's an interesting point of research. What has been found, and this database can also be very useful to try to assess these kind of mechanisms, is that return migrants come back to their communities in Mexico with higher human capital and higher financial capital. And that's having a positive effect on local labor market economic outcomes. Daniel Osuna published recently something about that, and it's very interesting. Now, the transit of South or Central American migrants through Mexico to the United States, the consequences on the United States, there is some research that has been done that from the pool of migrants from Central America that enter through Mexico and go to the United States, those who remain in Mexico are relatively negatively selected, and those that go all the way and end up in the US are positively selected, which is consistent with our paper, with our 2005 paper, in which if the costs to migrate to US are larger, then you would expect a more positive selection to the US and to Mexico. Now, having said that, using this database, but this is very, very preliminary still, I tried to assess to what extent the entry of Central Americans into Mexico, those who stay, to what extent that's influencing in the prevalence of substandard housing. That is what you could try to define as slums. In Chile, there was a project in which they analyzed with very good data, the effect that Venezuelan migrants going to Chile had on slum formation and growth. But they have a census of slums. We don't have that in Mexico. But using this database, I tried to assess at least where we have higher prevalence of substandard housing, no? By several measures. And there seems to be some effect. I mean, those local labor markets where more Central Americans end up have shown a larger increase in substandard housing. So that's interesting because it's...
Let's open to the audience for questions.
Thank you. Since the title of the event was on new developments in the labor markets, I will be the boring person talking about AI. So I wanted to ask you if you've thought about the possible impact of AI on the economy of Mexico, especially as I feel like my impression is that the current debate is very much focused on more kind of richer countries. I'm very curious about your thoughts on Mexico in particular. And one thing that I was thinking about, you showed us the impact of NAFTA, but together with NAFTA, we also saw the inclusion of English as a subject in many schools in Mexico. And so AI might be, for example, a tool to reduce language barriers, so maybe improving exports and so on. So I wanted to ask you if you had some thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Yes. I haven't seen research made on that, although some students are already telling me that they want to do their dissertation on that specific topic. So there is potential for that. But in the US, there's already some research going on. And I think, and it's not exactly my area of expertise, but I would believe that the kind of research that has to be made in terms of the labor market consequences of AI should be relatively similar to what has been done concerning the labor market consequences of robotization, no? Which there is a lot of work out there. So I haven't seen for the case of Mexico. I wouldn't say that that's not relevant for Mexico. In fact, I would believe that even with a different degree of development, AI may still be a very important shock for Mexico's labor markets if it becomes more widespread, which seems to be the case.
Hi, Professor. I have two questions. The first one is, we know that the North is more industrialized and the South has been has limited infrastructure, blah, blah. But I was wondering, what strategies can we, what can we do so that the positive effects of NAFTA can be brought to the South? Or do you think that the geographic that the geography would just like naturally limit all the positive effects that it could have. And my second question, you were saying that trade war had like this positive effect on labor markets, but then the China shock had a negative effect. Do you think they can compensate, or do you think that one will be over the other?
Okay. Okay, so the first part regarding the South, with the benefit of hindsight, because NAFTA started in 94, 30 years ago, we can conclude that the South was in a disadvantage given its geographical position. However, it is also the case, and there has been work written about this, that it had a lack of good communications and transportation system that would allow it to engage more in international trade activities. So there was also a lack of infrastructure problem in the South. Santiago Levy wrote a lot about that. Yeah, at the time. In fact, one of its papers was something like, why has the South been left behind, or something like that, precisely arguing that geography matters, but there's also other factors that matter and that have been limiting the Southern development. Now, maybe it's too early to say something about that, but Lorenzo showed some or spoke about this, and it's well known that the current government, starting with the last one we had in Mexico, has invested a lot in the South. So maybe that can have some positive effects in the future in terms of the ability of the South to engage in more modern economic activities. So that's one question. There's limits in terms of, and that's a relevant question of research, that in the South is characterized by very small, dispersed, and very isolated communities. It is precisely in the southern region where many of these local labor markets are one single site, small site. So in that sense, that's another challenge, because many of these communities do not have the size of the population to start some increasing return story to grow. So they remain poor on an ongoing basis. No?
This is really fascinating stuff. Just raises many more questions. I'm still puzzling. I mean, Mexico's aggregate performance post-NAFTA was so disastrous, in particular with regard to aggregate productivity, that how do we make that compatible with the fact that this is the period when exports boomed, as Gordon mentioned. It was also a period when inward foreign investment boomed, both consequences of NAFTA. And then your results that NAFTA in general increased wages and GDP per capita. So, I mean, how do we square the sort of the eyeball econometrics of pre-post, and then sort of this cross-sectional evidence across regions? I mean, there's an alternative story is that actually the aggregate effects of NAFTA on Mexico were negative, but that parts of the country that was closer to the northern border were affected less negatively than the rest. And then you would get that cross-sectionally, the effects were positive, but the aggregate effect were negative. How do I, is there any way of teasing the data that would sort of disprove that? And then I'm also, the skill premium, I'm just puzzling over that as well. What happens, did you try doing those skill premium regressions just for the formal sector? Because there is, in the back of my mind is also kind of a Harris Todaro story that competes with the Heckscher-Ohlin one, which is to say that, okay, maybe that you are increasing employment and wages as a consequence of NAFTA, but that's sort of driving migrants in or driving people into the labor force. But they are sort of like in weight unemployment or weight informality. So that's driving the measured skill premium down, whereas the skill premium in the formal sector is actually going up.
Yeah, that is, well, oh yeah. Starting with your second question first, that may surely be the case. I don't know, but we can use this data that even though on the aggregate we see increasing the skill premium, if we focus only on the formal sector of the economy, this may change. I'm not sure it will change dramatically because some of the results that I've gotten focus on the manufacturing industry, which is relatively more formalized than the remainder of the economy. However, it is the case that even within manufacturing, there are informal activities, so we should address that. One student is trying to work with these local labor market definitions, but with another data source for exports and employment, the economic census that just got published 1 month ago, to try to assess the robustness of these results with other databases. So that's something we're working on. But I agree, maybe in the specific formal sector of the economy, things may have been slightly different from what we see on the aggregate level. Now, your first question, yeah, it's very difficult to say NAFTA was good, but for some regions, or NAFTA was bad, but some regions were not as affected. I mean, where do you put the line? What is something that is seen in the data is that productivity growth in Mexico, total factor productivity, has been growing at a negative rate basically since the 80s. So if you see a TFP chart, even the one published by INEGI, the National Statistic Agency, the growth of TFP is negative across the board, except for the first 5 years of NAFTA. From 96 to 2000, there was positive TFP, not very large, and the reason why it was not very large, even when the booming exports and investment took place, may have been related to what I said to Hanson, to Gordon before, in terms of the lack of other factors that should be favorable for growth. But it is the case that if you see TFP, it is only in the first years of NAFTA, before the China shock, that we see positive rates. That's a discussion that can take years, but was the import substitution strategy in Mexico did have its desired effects or not? I mean, a very, very broad discussion. I agree.
We've got 2 final questions. Why don't we gather them and then give Danielle the final word.
Hi, so my name is Tahsin. So I'm from Bangladesh. So my question was, in the recent times, like Bangladesh has, like a lot of students from Bangladesh have been going to US and Canada. But in the last 2 years, we have been seeing that Canada's immigration policy has become a lot stricter. So previously people used to get a lot of visa to do their education and then settle in Canada. But the visa rejection rate has increased exponentially in the last 2 years, like 50% rejection rates from Bangladeshi students. So do you think that Mexico in this case can attract more skilled labor force from South Asia due to these policy changes in Canada's immigration? And if yes, then how do you think that Mexico should be strategizing to attract the skilled labor force of South Asia?
Let's gather the one more question and then give you the final word.
I think my question would be then, what kind of policies or how can you achieve the transformation of the labor force, like the lower skill to the higher skill side. Does that make sense? Because we were actually in Mexico City and working in the Mexico City government and trying to tackle like how to transform the economy, like how to achieve the economic development in Mexico City and Mexico's economy. And one answer we kind of like conclude is like nearshoring is actually one answer to that. But I think from these kind of results, what I learned is that if you don't have enough workforce, maybe it will actually lead to the decrease of the skill premium. So then what can we do? Is it like both demand side policy and the training of the labor force? Or is it like try to protect the domestic industry until you have enough skilled labor so that more, you can have much more skilled-based work? Does that make sense? Like that's the question I have.
I think the question is if nearshoring is depressing returns to skilled labor, what do you do?
If nearshoring decreases
The skill premium.
the skill premium, what should we do? Okay, yeah. So I think that both questions are somewhat related, no? So if I understood correctly, you're asking to what extent Mexico could become host of skilled labor, no? I think that should be welcome and will be welcome, and it is the case. I mean, Mexico, in fact, many universities in Mexico, I don't have precise figures, but from what I see, is a good host of students from other regions, other countries, South America, Central America. There's a lot of students who do their degrees in Mexico from these countries. So it shouldn't be a problem. The universities in Mexico are usually very open to host students from other countries, and that would help in the sense of what I said, to have a larger pool of skilled individuals working in Mexico. The story in India of students going to do their PhD in the United States, returning to India and improving productivity in India is well known. Now, if anything, what I was trying to convey is that we were expecting the nearshoring to raise the skill premium and to induce more people to become educated. Why that didn't happen, as I said, maybe it was too short, the time frame. And currently, unfortunately, this may be discussed, but I think that the nearshoring story is in kind of stopped, basically, given the current trade policies enacted by the United States. So in that sense, what Mexico can do, I don't think, and this is a personal opinion, I don't think that protection may be the mechanism through which we can boost the creation of skill in Mexico. I think that it would be too blunt an instrument. I would think more on focalized policies directed specifically to training. And in that sense, I have to acknowledge that the current government is working a lot on that. So let's hope it does have the desired results.
So Daniela, I want to thank you and your team for coming here today. And then also just thank you for the enormous public good that you provided, not just to Mexico, but to the world in the quality of the team you built in your decades heading economic research at Mexico's Central Bank. So thank you.